Hope y'all are having a great weekend. Welcome to another episode of Murders, Mysteries, and More. My name is Kaylee.
My name is Desi.
This week we will be covering the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders. Before we get into this case, we always encourage those who have useful information to any unsolved case. Please report it to your local police and sheriff department.
Many know about the dangers of taking too high of a dose of medicine. We know of the certain risks. Today, there are many safety precaution pharmacies put in place to prevent overdoses and children getting into medicine. However, these deaths we will be discussing today are not because of overdose. They happen because someone poisoned the Tylenol.
September 29, 1982, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up not feeling so well. Like any normal kid, she told her parents. Her parents are Dennis and Gina. She attended Adams Junior High School in Schaumburg, Illinois. She lived a couple blocks away in Elk Grove Village, a suburb in Chicago. Normally, when you are sick like this, you grab some Tylenol. She took Tylenol.
After she took the pills, she went into the bathroom and shut the door. 2 seconds later, there was a thud. Immediately, her father opened the door to check on Mary. Convulsing and not responding to him, he dialed 911. The ambulance showed up to take Mary to the hospital, and then the EMTs performed CPR on her. Before they reached the hospital, it was too late because Mary was dead.
What's incredibly sad and bizarre is that Mary was brain dead before they reached the hospital. Since Mary was only 12 years old and she died very quickly, they decided to perform an autopsy. However, her autopsy results looked normal. Police officers looked into the parents just in case because of her age. The police found nothing suspicious in their home. They suspected it was cardiac arrest.
Parents did notify the police and hospital staff that Mary had taken Tylenol. In fact, the hospital staff brought it with them. No one suspected the Tylenol up until this point. Noon, a couple hours later, 27-year-old Adam Janus decided to stay home from work. He did not feel great. He thought it was a cold.
Around 2 p.m. rolls around, he decides to pick up his kiddos from pre-K. He then decides to swing by the store to pick up some Tylenol. Once he gets home, he takes 2 extra strength Tylenol. He tells his wife right away he is not feeling very well. He falls down and starts convulsing. Immediately, his wife calls for an ambulance.
The ambulance rushes him to the Northwest Community Hospital. When he got to the hospital, they were unable to resuscitate him. He was pronounced dead at 3:15 p.m. They believed it was cardiac arrest despite his age because they had no idea. His family was very upset and they felt like it was not a good enough answer.
His family went home to mourn him. At 5 p.m., his little brother, who was 25 years old, wasn't feeling so well. He also had a wife named Teresa, who had a headache from crying so much. Both of them decided to take some Tylenol. After a few minutes go by, Stanley passes out. The family is obviously freaked out, so they call 911.
When the EMTs get there, they start performing CPR on Stanley. In the midst of it all, Teresa also passes out. While this is going on, the doctor is trying to figure out Adam's cause of death. The nurse alerts the doctor that the Janus family is coming back in. He thinks maybe it's the parent. It's not easy for any parent to lose a child at any age.
The nurse tells him it's not the parents, it's Stanley and his 19-year-old wife, Teresa. The doctor is very confused. It's not normal for something like this to happen at such a young age. Stanley died later that night at the hospital and his life was put on life support. The doctor is now thinking that since they all had the same symptoms, maybe they were poisoned somehow.
The hospital had never seen any poison cases before, so they called up the Rocky Mountain Poison and Drug Safety Center. The Poison Center suggested that it could have been from cyanide poison. Cyanide is a chemical
Asphyxiate.
Cyanide prevents oxygen from reaching red blood cells throughout the body, especially in the brain and the heart. It can cause nausea, seizures, confusion, headaches, loss of consciousness, and even death.
The hospital decided to collect blood samples to send to a local lab for testing. Police also went to the house to see if there were any signs of Adam using cyanide to clean his tools. Police found nothing. They also asked them what they remember they all consumed that day. 3 things came to mind: coffee, peaches, and Tylenol.
Philip Capitelli, an off-duty firefighter, heard both of the calls come from his police scanner. He thought the situation was very bizarre. Philip's mother-in-law worked with Mary Kellerman's mom. He remembers hearing from her that Mary died that same day. It clicked. Philip knew they had all Tylenol. Mary died at a different hospital, and that's why the hospital couldn't make the connection to the Tylenol at first.
When the doctors opened both bottles to compare them, they looked normal. Both bottles had the same lot numbers, so police decided to keep them for evidence. The medical examiners told the doctors to smell the bottles. They both had a slight scent of sweet almonds. An interesting fact is that only 50% of the population can detect the almond smell from cyanide.
So you have a 50-50 chance of being able to smell it or not. Interesting. Test results came back as positive for cyanide in the bottles. Their blood contained over 100 to 1,000 times the lethal amount of cyanide. After the chief medical examiner examined the bottles more closely, he discovered that some of the pills did look different from the others. As days went by, the cyanide began to eat away the pill capsules.
Others that were also killed that same day was Mary Lynn Rayner, a 27-year-old mom. She lived in Winfield, Illinois. September 29, 1982, Rayner just had left the hospital after giving birth to her 4th child. After giving birth, it takes time to bounce back to normal. Mothers go through a lot of pain during that time. So when she got home, she took 2 extra strength Tylenol.
A few minutes passed by. Rayner collapses on the floor. Her husband Ed calls 911. Mary passed away at 9:30 the next morning. What's even more crazy about this case is that there's a 3rd victim named Mary. Mary McFarland was from Lombard County. She worked at the Bell Phone Center in Yorktown Mall. She got a headache that day, so she took extra strength Tylenol.
She fell and started convulsing on the ground at work. She was rushed to the Good Samaritan Hospital. The hospital was located in Downers Grove, and she got there by 7:20 p.m. She stayed in the ICU and was pronounced dead hours later at 3:15 a.m. She was a mother of 2 little boys.
That same day, 35-year-old United Airlines flight attendant Paula Prince also took Tylenol at the Chicago O'Hare Airport. Unfortunately, Paula Prince was alone when she died. Since all these victims died at separate hospitals, their deaths weren't connected until Northwest Community Hospital had received results. Once they received the results that they died as a result of cyanide poisoning, they were able to notify the other hospitals.
In 1958, Johnson & Johnson had bought out McNeil Consumer Products. McNeil was responsible for pharmaceuticals containing acetaminophen, which is the active ingredient in Tylenol. In the 60s, Tylenol was the only brand to sell this type of over-the-counter pain reliever on the market. Even when others joined the market, Tylenol was considered the most trusted brand.
September 30th, the next day after all the victims had died, word got out fast. Tylenol had a press conference that day discussing the names of some of the victims. They also mentioned how the bottles had been poisoned with lethal doses of cyanide. Stores in Chicago started removing Tylenol off the shelves. People in other parts of the country also started to freak out and started throwing out their bottles of Tylenol.
Not only that, but people also started calling the poison control hotlines, panicking about the Tylenol they took a couple days ago. They didn't know that they were going to get sick and die as well. Police started going through Chicago neighborhoods with a megaphone screaming, "Throw out your Tylenol. Do not take any Tylenol." Johnson & Johnson immediately went to the medical examiner to learn more. They did not want blood on their hands.
Johnson & Johnson stopped distribution so they could prevent bottles from being tampered with. At first, Tylenol thought it was localized. However, they made the big decision on 3 p.m. of September 30th to recall all the Tylenol products throughout the country. Chicago Mayor Jane Byrne had a press conference that night at 11 p.m. and stated that Johnson & Johnson was not responsible for the deaths the Tylenol had caused. She also told everyone to throw theirs out regardless of the lot number.
Johnson & Johnson found a total of 50 out of 31 million bottles had contain 5 to 8 lace pills along with normal pills. By October 8th, the Attorney General and FBI had been working on this case, since Johnson & Johnson had taken responsibility by recalling the products. They prevented other deaths from happening. But the biggest question was, who laced the Tylenol?
They figured out the bottles had not been laced in the manufacturing plants. However, whoever did this took bottles from different stores. No store had any footage of someone putting a Tylenol bottle back on the shelf. October 6th, Johnson & Johnson received an unsigned letter. They were threatening to continue to lace the pills unless he received $1 million.
The FBI discovered this was a letter written by James Lewis. In December, the FBI found James Lewis in a New York library. Immediately, he was arrested and taken into custody. After investigating him further, they determined it was not him because he was not in Chicago by the time of the murders. This is critical information because whoever laced the Tylenol pills had to do it fast enough, because otherwise the cyanide would eat away the pills and it would be very obvious.
Police found out the account number James put on the letter did not belong to him. It belonged to Frederick McKay. He put his account number on there because he wanted the FBI to go after him, because he had been. The second suspect was Roger Arnold. He was at a bar showing off some white powder, claiming it was cyanide, and he was the Tylenol killer.
Police took him in for questioning and searched his home. They found no evidence of cyanide. When they took him in for further questioning, Rogers states he ditched the cyanide after the attack. What's crazy is that one of the victims, Mary Rayner, purchased Tylenol at a store across from Rogers' ex's house.
He also worked at a warehouse where Rayner's mother was a truck driver. Police questioned his ex-wife, and she says that she does not think Roger was capable of doing this attack. However, he had given her Tylenol before and she had thrown out. Police searched his house a second time and found tickets to Thailand. They also found crime books and white powder in his home, which later on were found to be harmless, so they cleared him.
Ted Kaczynski, aka the Unabomber, from 1978 to 1996, he was responsible for planting bombs that killed 3 people and injured 23 individuals. The FBI considered him a suspect because of his first bombing took place in Chicago. He denied any involvement in the Tylenol killings, and they didn't have much evidence to support Ted doing the killings.
Since the Tylenol murders, there has been a huge advancement in technology. In 2009, the FBI decided to open the case again and re-examine all the evidence they had. However, they were unable to progress any further. To this day, we do not know who committed these heinous crimes. We hope to figure out one day who laced the Tylenol pills and why they did it. Here are some questions. How did the killer get the cyanide poisoning in the Tylenol bottles so quickly? Cyanide would eat the capsules within 48 hours, and it had been obvious the bottles had been tampered with. The reason how he could have got cyanide in the bottles so quickly was he could have possibly bought some bottles with cash, so that way they wouldn't have any way of tracing it, and he could have taken them back to his home, put the cyanide in there, and then restocked them on the shelves, knowing that somebody would eventually pick up one of the bottles due to them having a headache or some other problem, and that they would take the pill and obviously die from the cyanide poisoning.
Yeah, that's definitely one way someone could have easily done it, is by purchasing the bottles beforehand. This person could have bought the bottles during the daytime, in there sometime during the day, and then put them back at night, and somebody getting home from work who had a headache or whatever could have purchased these bottles. Another theory that could have happened is that this person could have worked at a manufacturing plant before, and so they might know a lot of information about pharmaceuticals, and so they would have been able to tamper with them, and they would have known, since they worked at the pharmacy before, they would have known that they needed to quickly put the cyanide in there as fast as they can, because otherwise it would be obvious that the pills have been tampered with. How did the killer not get caught on camera tampering with the Tylenol bottles? Could they have possibly bought them beforehand? Like we said before, They could have totally purchased these bottles beforehand, or if they had worked with the pharmacy, whether or not they worked at a manufacturing plant, or they were even a CVS or Walgreens pharmacy technician, they could have tampered with them before they put it back on the shelves, and that's why it wasn't very trackable. Also, like we mentioned before, like the packaging back then was not very tamper proof. Now it's like it's really hard to open a bottle, and usually you have like the aluminum foil.
They also could have been a regular customer or known these stores well enough to where they could get around the cameras with knowing that they could be standing in a spot or something and not be caught by the cameras. They could have dressed like a regular citizen, could have been dressed in a hoodie to where, they kept their face from being shown in the camera. There's a lot of reasons why they could have not been caught, or maybe the FBI just didn't take the time that they needed to go through camera footage and look at every possibility of who it was instead of just narrowing it down to like a couple of people they thought it was.
They might not even have had any of the footage from the cameras at all, or if it was like an employee, they could have obviously taken it to a break room or some like back room, like a closet or whatever, and messed with it there and easily gotten away with it.
They could have paid somebody to go in and buy these Tylenol bottles for them. Could any of the suspects we previously mentioned before, James Lewis, Roger Arnold, or Ted Kaczynski, be responsible even though police did not have enough evidence to convict them? If so, which one of them do we believe fits the description of the Tylenol killer? Theory of possibly being one or more accomplices in this instead of just one person? Any of these suspects could be possibly it, even though police didn't have enough evidence to convict them. If they had an accomplice or a couple of accomplices in this, it would be a lot easier to cover your tracks, and it would be a lot harder to catch somebody in the act, especially if you have people going in and buying Tylenol bottles for you. The person that I kind of believe to be more likely to fit the description of the Tylenol killer would be Roger Arnold, especially with the way that he was acting and the fact that one of the stores that one of the Tylenols was purchased from was across from his ex's house, and he also worked in a warehouse where Mary Reiner's mother was also a truck driver. And the fact that his ex also said that, or she took a Tylenol from him before and threw up, is also very suspicious because he could have tampered with that and put something in her pill. As far as the other two, they're a little more unlikely than he is, but it also couldn't be him at all as well.
Yeah, I actually have two people on this that I potentially think. So like you did mention that Roger Arnold, he's definitely a little suspicious because he did go to a bar and he held out the white powder claiming it was cyanide. And yes, police later on found out the white stuff in his house was not cyanide, but he could have totally gotten rid of stuff before and ahead of time. And like you mentioned, with his ex living really close, and his ex also didn't feel very good after he gave her a Tylenol and she threw up immediately, makes me think that he could potentially be the one. But I also want to mention, now this is more of a wild theory, but this was a theory on Reddit, so it could also be Ted Kaczynski. And the reason why I mention this is because the college she was actually attending, one of the students there had died from so-called cyanide poisoning suicide. And you don't hear as many suicide cases from like stuff such as cyanide poisoning. You don't hear a lot about those sort of cases. So some people think that he potentially actually killed this other person. So that's where they make kind of a small link to him. His first bombing attack was in Chicago. However, there's still a huge lack of evidence. There's just not enough evidence to convict any of them. So those are a couple of people that it could be, but I'm still kind of iffy if any of them did it. I kind of feel like it was probably somebody else. Why did the killer choose to lace the Tylenol with the cyanide? So they clearly did this because of a couple different reasons. One of the reasons is maybe this was a psychopath that was trying to experiment with different ways to kill people, and they wanted to find a way to kill people but make it very hard for them to be tracked by the police. Tylenol was a very easy target because the packaging was not the greatest back then. It was super easy to tamper with. People trusted Tylenol and they were like, this could never happen. It was an easy way to kind of kill a bunch of people randomly without being tracked, because if they had to use something else such as like a gun or a knife or a bomb, the police would be able to find like DNA evidence, and they would be able to find, maybe they read a book about how to make a homemade bomb or whatever. But when it comes to lacing the Tylenol, it's very hard to trace any DNA amount in that. It's a lot easier to kill more people at once. More people are worried about people shooting them than buying Tylenol laced with cyanide that's gonna kill them.
Another reason why they could have chose to lace the Tylenol with cyanide. Tylenol is especially now and then, is, like you said, a very popular brand that everyone trusted. But cyanide kills people very quickly, especially due to the fact that it has the ability to induce chemical suffocation of cells, and it disrupts your processes like your enzymes, your organs, and all that stuff. So cyanide definitely kills people faster, especially in a large quantity, and especially through something as simple as a Tylenol pill. The serial killer would be able to kill a lot faster with cyanide versus if they were to choose something else like potassium or anything like that.
It sounds bad, but if that family of 3 that all died, if they all didn't die, then more deaths would probably have slipped through the cracks because there was no connection to the Tylenol. All the other people were at separate hospitals, but because they all died, they're able to stop it.
Was the killer's motive because of money or because of something else? It is noted that at the time, Johnson & Johnson had control of 37% of the pharmaceutical market. They also made 19% of their profits from Tylenol alone, and were making millions. Although this killer's motive could have been because of money or because of some grudge they had against the company, I feel like this was just some serial killer who got joy out of killing people multiple at a time. I feel like he was doing this to rack up his body count, and he got joy out of seeing people die. Most of the time, unfortunately, when things like this do happen, although it can be a motive of money and a grudge against the company, a lot of people do it because they have mental issues potentially, or because they find joy in torturing and killing people, which is very sad.
Yeah, and I also feel like if it was more of a target against Johnson & Johnson, they would probably have a lot more evidence. They would probably have more letters, and I feel like they would have probably been able to find the killer a lot faster, and it probably would have been in way more bottles, because although 1 bottle of lace pills full of cyanide is still too much, it was only 50 bottles out of 31 million. I feel like if it was somebody that was really off against the profits, they would have definitely targeted a lot more people. And I feel like this person, more of their motive was something to do with Chicago, or they were just wanted to experiment and see how many people they could kill.
But you would think if it was more aimed towards the company and money, they would have targeted their other products besides Tylenol as well, considering they had control 37% of the pharmaceutical market. So you would think they would target other products as well.
It was only the extra strength as well. So you would feel like they would also target the other forms of the Tylenol and their other products, like you said, but they didn't. and it definitely would have probably been on a much larger scale. Could the Tylenol killer be an ex-employee that maybe got fired and was upset with the company? So I do want to mention that the police did kind of go in to check the manufacturing plants and look and see if any of the bottles could have been tampered with at the manufacturing company. They didn't find anything. They also looked at lawsuits as well, and they couldn't make any connections with anybody who made lawsuits against them. It could still be an ex-employee, but it's probably not an ex-employee, because I feel like they would have definitely targeted more products and they would have done way more damage. They would have probably put cyanide in more than 50 bottles. They probably would have tried to put them in like hundreds, thousands of bottles.
Mary Reiner was the only victim who got her Tylenol bottle from the hospital. How did the Tylenol killer tamper her bottle without being caught? Maybe the reason why the Tylenol killer tampered her bottle and didn't get caught was maybe the hospitals carry Tylenol on hand. They get them in large quantities, of course. And most of the time, they do get them straight from the manufacturer, but sometimes they do get them from the pharmacies, of course. What could have possibly happened is that the Tylenol killer could have per se tampered her bottle without getting caught, but the hospital could have already had this bottle on hand, and one of the pills could have possibly already been slipped into that Tylenol bottle, and she could have just been, unfortunately, the unlucky person who was given this bottle with one of the pills in it, and that's how she died. The Tylenol killer could have possibly also snuck into the hospital, posed as an employee, or maybe was an employee at the hospital or the pharmacy in the hospital, and they could have tampered with the bottle as well. There's so many possibilities as to how it could have happened without knowing who the Tylenol killer was. We can't say for sure how it exactly happened.
In the hospital, they definitely, like you said, usually get it from the manufacturing. Sometimes they don't always do that. This kind of makes me think that it could potentially be somebody who either knew Mary Reiner and didn't like her and targeted her, but then targeted some of these other places because they didn't want to come off, this person only killed her, so it's specific. Now it's looking more like it's a random killing to police, so they might have done that to throw police off, so it could have been like an ex or whatever. It could have also been a hospital employee as well, like you said. What is our theory on the Tylenol murder? So I have a few different theories. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of evidence to point it towards one suspect. Like I mentioned before, did not like Mary Reiner, and they poisoned her bottle, but then they thought, oh, well, maybe I might get caught, so maybe I should go to some of these other stores and tamper with these bottles, and maybe some people will take these as well, and then it won't look like I'm just specifically targeting her. It'll look more random. But I also could see it as being just a straight up blatant random serial killer. There are some random serial killers out there that don't make a whole lot of sense. They just want to pretty much just straight up kill anybody in any way possible. And maybe this was like somebody who was kind of new to killing people and they weren't confident enough to do it in other ways. Maybe this person used to work in a pharmacy and they knew a lot about pharmacy drugs, and they're like, okay, well, how about I target a bunch of people by putting cyanide into these pills? It's going to be a lot less traceable. These people are going to die a lot faster, and it's just going to cause panic, and it's going to get so much attention, they're just going to get off of it. Or it could have been that it was one of those previous suspects, but at the time there was just not enough information for police, and they just cleared out the stuff beforehand. But I do definitely think that whoever did this had to know a little bit about cyanide poisoning. They probably clearly did their research, and they probably knew about the pharmaceuticals, and they figured that this would be the best way to kill people and get away with it.
I mean, I agree on everything that you said. I personally feel like this could have been one, two ways. This could have been the work of a serial killer who, like I've mentioned before, got off on seeing people die or hearing about it, or got off on the fact that people went into a frenzy about cyanide being. This could have been somebody who specifically targeted these people, knew these people, and wanted these people dead, and this is how they chose to do it. Whether or not all the people who died were their targets is the real question. Maybe one or two of them, maybe a couple, could have accidentally died and they weren't their targets, but I feel like maybe some were targeted intentionally, maybe some weren't, or maybe even multiple people assisted in this as well and just wanted to create such a frenzy for Tylenol, for Johnson & Johnson, in order to see their, stock crash, basically.
Yeah. And like all bad things, there's usually something good that comes out of it. 6 weeks after these deaths, Johnson & Johnson implemented new packaging for their products. They now included a safety seal and aluminum foil over the top of the bottle. The capsules were reformulated so it'd be more difficult to tamper with. That's why today we don't have instances like these happening again, and Johnson & Johnson's response is exactly how we as America should respond to acts of violence. We should come together like the way they did and put safety first over profits, and that's exactly what Johnson & Johnson did.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Murders, Mysteries, and More. Remember to always keep your eyes open. You never know when someone's creepy.